September 12, 2012, a day of tragedy. On September 12, 2012, Austin, Texas police responded to an emergency call from a local gym. Inside, they discovered the lifeless body of 19-year-old gym instructor Luke Marshall. What initially seemed like a tragic accident soon unraveled into a shocking web of deceit, betrayal, and secret affairs involving 3 older women from Luke's community. By the time investigators uncovered the truth, it was too late. Luke was gone and his scandalous relationships had come to light. Luke's attraction to older women. Luke Marshall, a 19-year-old gym instructor, had always been drawn to older women. Though he didn't fully understand this inclination, his new job at the gym in early 2012 brought clarity. Many older women who frequented the gym showered him with compliments and extended their conversations with him. He realized they appreciated his attention, which, in turn, gave him a thrill. By March 2012, Luke had grown especially close to 3 neighborhood women: Helen, Barbara, and Margaret. Helen, the lonely widow. Helen, 65, lived in a nearby retirement community. After losing her husband, she began attending the gym to stay active. Luke quickly noticed her loneliness and how her demeanor brightened when he gave her attention. Initially hesitant, Helen eventually let her guard down. By late March, their connection moved beyond the gym. They began meeting at local motels, and their relationship became physical. Barbara, the bold seductress. Barbara, 67, had been a widow for several years. Unlike Helen, Barbara was confident and direct. She made her attraction to Luke evident, and it didn't take long for him to respond. By the end of March, they had started an affair. They met at Barbara's home when her family was away, as well as at other private locations. Barbara's intense affection for Luke led her to shower him with gifts, hoping to secure his undivided attention. Margaret, the reserved divorcee. Margaret, 62, had recently gone through a difficult divorce. Unlike Helen and Barbara, she was more reserved and cautious. However, she couldn't resist Luke's charm and attentiveness. Their bond slowly developed, and by spring she too was involved with him. A deadly tangle of secrets. As Luke juggled these affairs, tensions began to rise. Each woman believed she had a special connection with him, unaware of the other's involvement. Jealousy and rivalry simmered beneath the surface, threatening to boil over. By September, the situation reached its breaking point. The truth about Luke's relationships came to light, leading to a confrontation that turned violent. The events of that fateful day left Luke dead, and the community in shock. Aftermath. The investigation revealed the intricate and volatile nature of Luke's secret relationships. Helen, Barbara, and Margaret's lives were forever changed, and the tragedy served as a stark reminder of the dangers of deceit and unchecked passion. Margaret initially came to the gym to rebuild her life after a challenging period. She found comfort in Luke's charisma, and their friendly gym conversations gradually turned into private encounters. At first, Margaret was hesitant, but by May she couldn't resist Luke's allure. Their affair began discreetly, with Margaret keeping their connection as low profile as possible. Luke's relationships with Helen, Barbara, and Margaret remained entirely separate, with none of the women aware of the others. Each believed she held a special place in Luke's life, oblivious to the tangled web he was weaving. This secret existence gave Luke a sense of power and control. He relished the attention and devotion of these women, knowing they would do almost anything to keep him close. Their secret meetings were frequent and increasingly bold. Luke would meet Helen under the cover of night, either at motels or her quiet home. Barbara, in contrast, preferred daytime encounters at her house, often initiating their meetings with bold confidence. Margaret, ever cautious, chose more secluded locations like quiet parks or Luke's apartment late at night, as her need for his affection grew stronger over time. By June 2012, these affairs had become far more complicated. Helen, once reserved and hesitant, was now consumed by thoughts of Luke. She fantasized about a future with him and even considered moving closer to spend more time together. Despite keeping their affair secret from her friends and family, Helen had become deeply attached, believing their connection was unique and meaningful. Barbara, on the other hand, grew increasingly possessive. By June, she was noticeably jealous when Luke missed their planned meetings. Determined to maintain his attention, she lavished him with extravagant gifts, including expensive watches and gym equipment. In her mind, their relationship was exclusive, and she convinced herself that Luke cared for her just as deeply as she did for him. Margaret, the quietest of the three, developed a profound emotional dependence on Luke. Recently divorced, she found solace in their time together and structured her life around their secret encounters. Though she tried to stay cautious, by July 2012, her feelings for Luke had deepened significantly. She truly believed Luke cared for her well-being and preferred their meetings in private, where she could fully embrace their connection without fear of discovery. As summer progressed, Luke's tangled web of relationships became more precarious. Each woman's growing attachment and need for exclusivity heightened the stakes. The thrill that Luke once enjoyed began to wane as jealousy, suspicion, and emotional dependence threatened to unravel his carefully maintained facade. Helen cherished every moment she spent with Luke, even if those moments were fleeting and stolen. For Luke, managing his relationships with Helen, Barbara, and Margaret felt like an exhilarating challenge. He enjoyed their admiration and attention, but the emotional needs of the three women were beginning to weigh on him. Each woman desired more time, more affection, and more exclusivity. Their infatuation with Luke's youthful energy and charm kept them captivated, and he was careful to prevent any of them from discovering his other affairs. However, as July came to an end, the unspoken tensions among the women unknowingly escalated. Luke maintained his secret life with precision, meeting Helen in the evenings at her retirement community, Barbara during the day at her house, and Margaret in secluded locations late at night. He relished the control he thought he had over the situation, believing he could continue juggling these relationships indefinitely. But the reality was far different. Unbeknownst to him, the emotional attachment of Helen, the possessiveness of Barbara, and the quiet longing of Margaret were converging like a storm waiting to break. By the end of July, all three women were unknowingly competing for Luke's attention. The delicate balance he had managed so far was about to collapse. August 2012, the beginning of the end. In August 2012, the careful facade Luke had built began to crumble. The unraveling started on the night of August 15th, with an unexpected visit from Helen. She had been feeling uneasy for weeks, sensing a shift in Luke's behavior. He had grown distant, canceling their meetings, and seeming distracted even when they were together. Seeking reassurance, Helen decided to visit him unannounced. As she neared the gym late that evening, she noticed something unusual. The lights were still on, despite it being well past closing time. Curious and slightly apprehensive, Helen decided to investigate further. What she discovered that night would set off a chain of events that neither she nor Luke nor the other women could have anticipated. The truth was beginning to surface, and the fragile web of lies Luke had spun was on the verge of unraveling completely. Helen entered the gym quietly, hoping to surprise Luke. Instead, she was met with a shocking scene. Luke wasn't alone. He was with Barbara. The sight of them together, so intimate and familiar, made her heart pound. She froze in place, unable to process what she was witnessing. Everything she thought she knew about her relationship with Luke shattered in an instant. Helen's shock quickly turned to anger. Unable to bear the betrayal, she stormed out of the gym, her mind racing. She felt humiliated, realizing she had been deceived. What she thought was a genuine connection had been nothing more than a fleeting conquest for Luke. The sting of betrayal grew sharper with every step she took on her way home, her thoughts darkening with each passing moment. August 16th. The confrontation. The next day, Helen's simmering anger boiled over. She confronted Luke at her home, demanding answers. Her fury was palpable as she pressed him for the truth. Luke, caught off guard by her outburst, saw no point in lying anymore. Without hesitation, he admitted the truth. He had been using her, Barbara, and Margaret for his own pleasure. Luke coldly confessed that he was drawn to older women for the thrill and that the relationships were purely physical. There was no emotional connection for him, only a selfish pursuit of his fantasies. His words were devoid of remorse, cutting Helen deeply. Helen was devastated. She had believed their bond was genuine, something meaningful. Now she saw the cold reality. She had been manipulated and discarded. Her heartbreak quickly turned into fiery rage as she stormed out, vowing not to let this betrayal go unanswered. Helen's growing fury. In the days that followed, Helen's anger consumed her. She couldn't stop thinking about what Luke had done, not only to her but to the other women as well. She was certain Barbara was involved, but she began to suspect Margaret might also be part of Luke's deceit. The betrayal festered, pushing Helen to a breaking point. Meanwhile, Barbara started noticing changes in Luke's behavior. He was growing distant, and her suspicions began to grow. Though she didn't yet know the full extent of his infidelity, the seeds of doubt were firmly planted. Barbara's possessiveness intensified as she felt her grip on Luke slipping away. September 12th. The breaking point. By early September, the tension was unbearable. Helen, unable to move past her anger, decided it was time to confront Luke once more. On September 12, 2012, she made her decision final. Luke would have to face the consequences of his actions. What happened next would bring their tangled web of lies and betrayal to a tragic and irreversible end. Helen wanted answers. Answers she couldn't get in public. She needed a private moment to confront Luke, to make him face what he had done to her and the others. Knowing he often stayed late at the gym to clean up, she waited until after dark to confront him. Her anger was palpable as she made her way to the gym that night, her mind racing with thoughts of betrayal and revenge. When Helen arrived at the gym around 9 p.m., she found Luke alone, tidying up the equipment. The dim lighting cast long, eerie shadows across the room, adding tension to the already heavy atmosphere. Helen entered silently, but the intensity in her expression made it clear this wasn't a visit to reconcile. Without hesitation, Helen launched into a tirade, accusing Luke of using her, Barbara, and Margaret. Her voice was sharp with anger and heartbreak as she laid bare her fury. Luke, ever unrepentant, brushed off her accusations with his usual indifference. His cold, dismissive attitude only fueled Helen's rage. As their argument escalated, Helen's emotions spiraled out of control. She felt humiliated and betrayed, used in the worst possible way. Standing there, watching Luke's detached demeanor, something inside her broke. Her vision blurred with fury as she scanned the room for a way to release her anger. That's when her eyes fell on a heavy dumbbell lying nearby. Before she could think, her rage took over. She grabbed the dumbbell, her hands trembling with fury, and in one swift motion, swung it at Luke's head. The sickening thud echoed through the empty gym as Luke collapsed to the floor, lifeless. Helen stood frozen, staring at his crumpled body. The reality of what she'd just done hit her like a wave, leaving her in a state of shock. The dumbbell slipped from her hands, landing with a hollow clang beside Luke's motionless form. Blood pooled beneath him, a grim testament to the finality of her actions. Helen's heart raced as panic set in. She thought about running but couldn't move, her legs rooted to the spot. Just then, the gym door creaked open. Margaret stepped inside, unaware of the horror she was walking into. She had come to see Luke, as she often did late at night. Her eyes widened in shock as she took in the scene, Luke's lifeless body on the floor, and Helen standing frozen beside him. Blood stained the floor, and the air was heavy with the weight of what had just transpired. Margaret's breath caught in her throat as panic overwhelmed her. Without saying a word, she turned and ran, her footsteps echoing down the empty hallways. She disappeared into the night, leaving Helen alone with the consequences of her actions. Realizing the gravity of her situation, Helen knew she had to act quickly. Shaking, she grabbed her phone and made a call to Barbara. In a hushed, frantic voice, she explained what had happened, setting into motion a chain of events that would forever change their lives. Barbara quickly understood the seriousness of Helen's situation and rushed to the gym. When she arrived, the two women quickly concocted a plan. They decided to frame Margaret for Luke's death, knowing she had been there shortly after the incident. Together, Helen and Barbara hid the dumbbell, wiping down any evidence that might link them to the crime. They carefully staged the scene to make it appear as though Margaret had attacked Luke. By the time they finished, the gym was eerily silent once again, and the two women left, leaving Luke's body and the truth concealed. September 13th, 2012. The discovery. The next morning, the Austin Police Department received a call reporting the death of Luke Marshall, a 19-year-old gym instructor found lifeless inside the gym where he worked. Initially, the scene looked like a tragic accident. Luke had sustained a head injury, and with weights and gym equipment scattered around, it appeared he might have suffered an unfortunate mishap. Investigators initially leaned toward an accidental death, but something didn't feel right to the officers. As the day progressed, detectives began questioning people close to Luke, including his three neighbors, Helen, Barbara, and Margaret. Helen and Barbara cooperated with the investigation, but quickly pointed fingers at Margaret, alleging she had been acting strangely in recent weeks and had grown increasingly erratic. They claimed Margaret had been the last person seen with Luke on the night of his death, raising suspicions around her. With these statements, detectives shifted their focus toward Margaret, now considering the possibility of foul play. Margaret, still traumatized from discovering Luke's body, was immediately brought in for questioning. Her anxiety and confusion only deepened suspicion. Struggling to explain her presence at the gym that night, Margaret's inability to give a clear account seemed incriminating, and investigators began to see her as a prime suspect. Uncovering the truth. As the investigation continued, a significant lead emerged. A gym cleaner, who had been present on the night of the incident, came forward with a shocking revelation. He had been in the restroom when the confrontation occurred and overheard everything. Hidden from sight, the cleaner had stayed quiet to avoid getting caught up in the situation, but what he heard was unmistakable. He provided investigators with a detailed account of Helen's furious accusations and the violent sound that followed. Additional evidence came from nearby security footage, which provided a critical breakthrough. The footage showed Helen entering the gym late in the evening on September 12th, before Luke's death, and Margaret fleeing shortly afterward. However, there was no footage placing Margaret near Luke at the time of the attack, and the timeline didn't align with her as the perpetrator. The cleaner's testimony, combined with the security footage, started to paint a different picture of the events. Investigators now had enough to re-examine the case, and forensic evidence would soon solidify the truth. The evidence unfolds. Forensic analysis revealed traces of Luke's blood on Helen's clothing. Additionally, the dumbbell used as the murder weapon was found poorly hidden in a gym storage closet, implicating Helen and Barbara in a cover-up. The physical evidence pointed clearly toward a conspiracy orchestrated by the two women. In the end, Helen and Barbara's attempt to frame Margaret unraveled under the weight of evidence. Their betrayal and actions were laid bare, and justice caught up with them. October 15, 2012. Arrest and charges. On October 15, 2012, Helen Carter and Barbara Martin were arrested for the murder of Luke Marshall. Both women faced charges of murder and conspiracy to cover up the crime. Confronted with a mountain of evidence, including the cleaner's testimony, security footage, and forensic findings, the truth of their roles in Luke's death became undeniable. Margaret, though still shaken by her traumatic experience, was officially exonerated. She had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time, and her innocence was finally proven. The trial begins. The trial of Helen Carter and Barbara Martin commenced on November 10, 2012, in Austin District Court. The case received considerable media attention due to the shocking nature of the crime and the unexpected involvement of two older women in a murder. The courtroom was packed as the prosecution laid out the chilling sequence of events that led to Luke's tragic death. The prosecution argued that Helen, enraged by Luke's betrayal, had killed him in a moment of uncontrollable anger. They presented security footage, forensic evidence, and the cleaner's account of Helen's confrontation with Luke, which turned violently fatal. Barbara, they claimed, had helped Helen conceal the murder and frame Margaret, intending to divert suspicion. The defense sought to argue that Helen's actions had not been premeditated, framing them as a crime of passion fueled by deep emotional distress and humiliation caused by Luke's manipulative behavior. They portrayed Helen as a victim of Luke's deceit, deeply hurt by his betrayal. They also tried to downplay Barbara's involvement, suggesting that she acted out of panic rather than any deliberate intent. A strong case against Helen and Barbara. Throughout the trial, the prosecution built a compelling case. Witnesses recounted the nature of Luke's relationships with the women, painting a picture of his multiple affairs. The cleaner's testimony, along with security footage showing Helen entering the gym and Margaret fleeing shortly afterward, proved especially damaging. The cleaner's account of Helen's confrontation and the sounds of violence heard that night added further weight against her. The prosecution argued that Helen and Barbara had knowingly conspired, with forensic evidence supporting that Helen's clothing contained traces of Luke's blood. The poorly hidden dumbbell used in the attack was clear proof of their involvement. Verdict and sentencing. On March 20, 2013, after weeks of testimony and review, the jury reached a verdict. Helen was found guilty of second-degree murder. The jury concluded that, while her actions may not have been planned, they were unjustifiable and driven by misplaced rage. Helen received a sentence of 25 years in prison. Barbara, convicted of conspiracy to cover up the crime, received a 10-year prison sentence for her role in hiding the murder weapon and attempting to frame Margaret. Aftermath and community shock. Margaret, although legally cleared, found it difficult to move beyond the horrific events. The scandal left an indelible mark on her life, and whispers of the story lingered in the quiet Austin neighborhood. The community struggled to process the sordid details of the affair and the murder that had disrupted their seemingly tranquil suburb. The trial of Helen Carter and Barbara Martin became a national story, a shocking tale of betrayal, anger, and deadly consequences. The tragedy of Luke Marshall's short life and his tangled relationships left a lasting impression on the community. This case served as a powerful cautionary tale about the dangers of deception, lust, and betrayal in even the most unexpected places. The dark tale of Luke Marshall's affairs and the dramatic unraveling of a suburban community remains one of the most haunting in Austin's history. If you want more content like this, make sure to subscribe for daily updates, and don't miss our next story about the housewives whose affairs led to a shocking tragedy.